After short stints with right-wing governments, many countries in Latin America are electing leftist leaders. How will that impact the geopolitics of the region? Hello, I'm Mike Wilder, sitting in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. The pendulum appears to be swinging back to the left. Since 2018, many countries in Latin America have replaced right-wing or centrist leaders with leftist governments, a trend that picked up speed last year. And now in 2022, we could see Colombia and the continent's biggest country, Brazil, following suit. To learn more about this, let's go to Sao Paulo to talk with CGTN correspondent Paulo Cabral. Paulo, Latin America had left-wing governments in the early 2000s, replaced those leaders with right-wing politicians. Now, is the trend actually coming full circle?
That's right. We see the cycle happening again in Latin America. The right-wing wave that swept across the continent in recent years appears to be shifting again. The first signs of this leftist resurgence were seen in Mexico in 2018 with the landslide presidential victory of Andrés Manuel López Obrador. Then 1 year later in Argentina, Kirchnerism returned to power with the victory of President Alberto Fernandez alongside former President Cristina Kirchner as his vice president, and that just after 1 year of the term of the right-wing businessman Mauricio Macri as president. Then we have Bolivia. There, Evo Morales was forced to resign, and a right-wing politician took over as interim president. But shortly after, socialists returned to power in a commanding election win by Luis Arce. Then in Peru, school teacher and trade unionist Pedro Castillo ended years of conservative governments with a victory over right-wing opponent Keiko Fujimori. We have also Honduras. Leftist Xiomara Castro, wife of the former president Manuel Zelaya, deposed in a coup d'etat 12 years ago, brought the country back to the left wing and also became its first female president in elections held late last year. Then Chile. First, we had right-wing candidates winning only 37 of the 155 seats of the assembly to rewrite the country's constitution earlier in 2021. And then by the end of the year in December, leftist candidate Gabriel Boric won the presidential elections and became, at 35 years old, the youngest president in the country's history. And then we have Brazil, and trouble may be ahead for the right-wing president Jair Bolsonaro. He's running very low, both on his popularity ratings and also on opinion polls as well, behind former President Lula da Silva, that seems now with good potential to win the elections, even though we know politics can change at any time. Elections will happen later this year in Brazil.
Yeah, and in the case of Brazil, the biggest economy in the region, what are some of the challenges for the left wing to actually win and stay in power?
Well, look, the first big challenge is the left wing to be able to unite themselves around a strong name, and right now the strong name seems to be Lula da Silva, but you know, he's a very, at the same time, popular among many, but also a controversial figure. There were many charges of corruption during his government. You know that he spent time in jail. After he was acquitted, he was released, but still a very controversial figure. Many people in Brazil think that the country should actually have other leaderships being created and not to depend on Lula da Silva, that among left-wingers in Brazil. So the first thing would be to be able to unite the left wing around the name. And now something else that former President Lula da Silva is trying to do is to try and attract other politicians from other aisles of the spectrum, particularly from the center and center to the right. Actually, one attempt of Lula now is trying to make Geraldo Alckmin, former governor of Sao Paulo, a historic figure of the Social Democratic Party, of which has just left because of internal disputes. And so Lula da Silva is trying to bring Geraldo Alckmin to his ticket in a way of balancing it and also attracting more conservative voters in Brazil that possibly would not vote for Lula da Silva, but could be convinced if he had a more center to the right politician with him on the ticket.
Yeah, it'll be fascinating to watch. That was Paulo Cabral from Sao Paulo. I want to thank him as well. To go just a little bit deeper into what this change could mean for the region, let's bring in our experts from Boston. Jorge Heine is a former Chilean ambassador to China and author of the book Active Non-Alignment in Latin America, A Doctrine for the New Century. Joining us from Rio de Janeiro, Claudia Trevisan. She is the executive director of the Brazil-China Business Council. And from New Jersey, Arthur Estopinan is international and public affairs chief with the Estopinan Group, a consultancy firm. And Jiang Shixue is director of the Center for Latin American Studies at Shanghai University. He joins us from Beijing. We want to welcome all of you to the broadcast. Arthur, let me start with you. Latin America, as we pointed out, went through this pink tide in the early 2000s. Then we saw people like Bolsonaro and Duque and Macri and Piñera. In June, Reuters asked the question in an article they had, is this another pink tide? Is that what we're witnessing right now, and if so, why?
Well, the reality is that the previous government did not really deliver, the more conservative governments did not really deliver what their citizens were seeking, which is perhaps better education, greater economic growth and stability. And so now they're very interested in moving to the left, to change the government, because what the more conservative governments provided was not satisfactory to them.
Yeah, Ambassador Heine, just to kind of piggyback off of that, you recently wrote an article, and I'm going to read part of it, quote, "The current trend to oust incumbent rulers is a reaction against their incompetence in handling the twin challenges of the pandemic and the recession that hit the region in 2020. So is it your view that this really doesn't have much to do with right or left? It's just a matter of missteps, and the voters are going to the polls and saying, look, we don't like the direction we're going in?
Well, there are two things. The first thing is to say that the current governments didn't deliver, as my colleague on the panel has said, is a bit of an understatement. Latin America right now is going through its worst crisis in 120 years, according to the United Nations ECLAC Commission. It's basically ground zero in the pandemic. Latin America is 8% of the world's population and 30% of the world's death from the pandemic. The economic crisis is such that in 2020, the GDP of Latin America went down by 7.7%, whereas world GDP went down by 3.5%. And even projections for this year, when many people thought we might be coming out of this, are that Latin America would only grow at 3%, which means that it will grow less than all other regions in the world. So the point I'm trying to make is that Latin America is going through a big crisis. The existing governments have been extremely incompetent in handling it, and thus the reaction to vote for different parties and to vote for parties that offer something different.
Claudia, to that point, poverty in the region is at a 20-year high. It's not just the GDP. We're seeing a lot of people languishing in poverty, many countries facing double-digit unemployment figures as well. Poverty and inequality, though, were present before COVID. The pandemic has only made it much worse. So these leaders coming in, they're facing some rather daunting tasks, aren't they?
Yeah, and I think poverty is one of the main challenges in Latin America. And I think the main, of course, there are the need for social programs, especially income transfers, as we had in Brazil today and as we had during the pandemic. But the main policy to combat poverty is economic growth. And I think China is a big example of that. China was successful in taking 800 million people out of poverty mainly through economic growth. And Latin America is in a very bad situation. The economic outlook for this year of economic growth was reduced to 2.4%, which is an extremely low level for a region that like Latin America. And the prospects for the following years are not good as well. And there are a lot of structural issues that prevent Latin American countries from having stronger growth. And I think one of the main problems is a lack of integration among the countries in the region, a lack of connectivity. When you look at Asia, which is the most dynamic region economically in the world today, you see a very strong connectivity among the countries. And you see industrial production chains that spans through the whole region. And we have nothing similar in Latin America. There is no connectivity. We have a huge deficit of infrastructure that prevents this integration. So that is one big challenge. And another big challenge is education. We are not going to solve our lack of competitiveness problem without solving the problem of the low quality of education in the region. So social policies are needed for sure, but they are not enough. We need economic growth.
But Professor Jiang, a recent article published by the Global Times says that this rejuvenated pink tide may favor China in economic investment and closer political cooperation. Of course, China has a policy based on non-interference in internal affairs. But do you see this as perhaps creating more of an opportunity for even deeper engagement with China and the region?
Well, first of all, I just want to point out that China's foreign policy is not based on any ideology. So no matter the ruling party is on the right or on the left, it has nothing to do with China's foreign policy. You can see that over the past 20 years, China has developed a relationship with all kinds of countries in the region. So we don't care whether the left is on the rise or not. Now, secondly, I want to say that, yes, as our colleague has said just now, well, some people say that can China be the white knight for the region this time? Because Latin America is suffering from the so-called twin pandemic, pandemic of COVID-19 and the pandemic of poverty. So in order to overcome the pandemic of poverty, this region needs investment, needs overseas market. And in this regard, I don't believe that China can save Latin America, but China can offer a certain kind of help. China can buy more products from there, and China can make more investment. So let's hope that we can cooperate in the near future in the so-called Belt Road Initiative or other kinds of programs. I believe China can make a certain kind of contributions to the economic recovery in Latin America this time.
You know, Arthur, the United States has always considered Latin America part of its sphere of influence, dating back, of course, to the Monroe Doctrine. But the U.S. seems to be losing impact in the region. The New York Times, in a recent article, suggests the shift to the left may further erode U.S. influence. Do you think that's true?
Yeah, unfortunately, I do. Whether you have a Republican administration or a Democratic administration, the reality is that Latin America has been left as a stepchild. The U.S. has not really paid the necessary investment or attention in the region as we should. Perhaps there is a cultural divide between the United States and Latin America that maybe we don't understand Latin America as much as we should. But we should, because there is a tremendous economic impact on the United States if we would invest in Latin America, and from Bush to Clinton, Obama, I mean, all of them have really ignored Latin America. And as my colleague was saying, without the proper education of helping the students focus on engineering, mathematics, science, technology, those kids are not going to be able to compete in a global economy. And so they're just being left further and further behind. And my other colleague stated that China doesn't really care whether the government is right or left. And a good example of that, we see that in El Salvador with President Bukele. President Bukele is to the right of his government, and yet he counts on China for all kinds of different partnerships and development. So the U.S. really needs to wake up and understand the potential that Latin America offers. It's not a handout. It's not foreign aid. It's a vital partner with the U.S., and we should consider them as such.
Ambassador Heine, Peter Hakeem, who's the President Emeritus of the Inter-American Dialogue, suggested on this broadcast about 6 months ago that a lot of this might be traced back to the United States and the fact that Latin America has just lost its importance to the U.S. aside from migration. Do you think that's spot on as well? And how do you change that?
Well, I would say the following. It's important to look at current economic trends. I was just looking at the numbers of China-Latin American trade in 2021. It reached a record $451 billion, which is 40% more than was the case in 2020. Last time I looked, trade between the United States and Latin America was somewhere around 650 billion, something like that. If these trends continue, in a few years, China will do more trade with Latin America than the United States does. It already does more with South America than the United States does. So these are long-term trends that you cannot really change from one day to the next. Now, to your earlier point on the change towards the left in Latin America, one could say, well, you know, this is just the pendulum. Things are bad. The attitude now is throw the rascals out, and in a few years it will change again. Well, I would question that. There may be something deeper going on here. President-elect Boric in Chile has said that neoliberalism was born in Chile and it will die in Chile. And by this he meant that the common mistake is made by saying that neoliberalism, the neoliberal era, started with Margaret Thatcher and with Ronald Reagan. That is not true. The neoliberal era started with General Pinochet in Chile. And people are sick and tired of that, of the insecurity, of making not just a market economy, but a market society, of people not getting pensions that allow them to live in a dignified manner. And the project of the left in Latin America, in Chile and elsewhere, is to provide a dignified life to people, that they do not have to live in insecurity. Half the workforce in Latin America works in the informal sector, meaning they have no contracts, no job security, no health insurance, nothing. And that is part of the reason the pandemic hit the region so bad. Governments told people, you must keep social distance. People live in such cramped conditions that they cannot keep social distance. So it seems to me that the new governments that are coming in have their work cut out for them. And eradicating the bane of neoliberalism, it seems to me, is a huge task, and we'll see whether they're up to it.
Professor Jiang, you talked about this white knight quality, perhaps China helping out Latin America. Obviously, they could probably use a helping hand from the United States as well. Is there any way there might be some cooperation with both helping with investments in the country or helping with the pandemic, do you think, or are both countries just going in different directions?
Well, you know, I just want to say that let's put ideology aside for the moment. You know, China's foreign policy is very pragmatic, and Latin America is suffering from the so-called twin pandemics. So we can see that there's a kind of big room of cooperation for the two sides. At the same time, of course, we can understand that the U.S. also wants to maintain its the so-called sphere of influence. And China does not want to challenge the US in this regard. So the big problem is how the triple sides can cooperate in a way which is beneficial for the so-called triangulation of cooperation. The problem is whether or not the US will put aside down the so-called ideology, and let's seek better ways of cooperation in a better way in the so-called triangulation.
Arthur, you know, a two-part question. During the pink tide in the early 2000s, we saw commodities kind of booming in the region, and as a result, China needed those commodities, and that helped, of course, lift some folks out of poverty. But, you know, the thing about commodities, you got boom or bust. And I talked to an expert about the region recently who suggested that, you know, really what the region needs to focus on right now is this digital divide. It's behind. There's a digital revolution underway. Is that an area where you think China might be able to help the region, and should they be focused more on that?
Well, as I mentioned, I agree with this expert that you highlight, because that's exactly what I said. Without innovation, with the STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, the region is not going to move forward. It's not going to grow in a global economy. So that person is absolutely right, and I do believe that Latin America will accept the help, be it from whomever it is. I mean, they're very poor and they need a lot of help. And if the United States is lacking that leadership, you see other countries that are going to come in, China, Russia, Iran, and others in our hemisphere. And that's a sad statement to the lack of leadership from the United States. And I hope our US leaders see the potential that we need to help our Latin friends, and it's going to help in the United States as well. But one comment that I would like to add with this discussion, we would fail this discussion if we do not mention the situation in Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, which have been a perennial communist socialist state, and they're a total failure. There are 6 million Venezuelans that have fled Venezuela to Colombia, Ecuador, and other countries in the vicinity because of the failed socialist policies in that country. So I believe that we cannot overread this change to the left in Latin America. The reality is that the right-wing government didn't provide, as my colleague said, for their COVID relief, and now those countries' economies are decimated. So they want to try something different. But the left, unfortunately, has a very poor history in Latin America.
You know, Professor Jiang, Claudia has talked about connectivity. Go ahead. You were going to say?
You just now mentioned the so-called digital gap. Well, you know, China can offer a certain kind of help. China's Huawei, the so-called 5G, is very advanced. But the United States is not happy to see that Chinese companies, Huawei, can offer a certain kind of help with its 5G technology for Brazil, for also for other countries in South America. So we have to deal with this kind of US fact in dealing with the so-called digital gap.
Ambassador Heine, can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, as somebody who's you know, worked on the diplomatic front, you know, blocking those efforts, what's the point of that?
Sure. Well, but before that, let me say the following. To say that the left has a bad record in Latin America does not reflect reality. Some of the governments with the best record in Latin America in the course of the past 20 years.
Those countries are decimated.
That of Lula in Brazil.
Cuba.
Arthur, look, you were allowed to talk. We'll let the ambassador speak.
Yeah, that's right, but yes. Yeah, but I totally disagree with that.
The record of Brazil under President Lula, the record of Chile under President Lagos and Bachelet, the record of Uruguay under the Frente Amplio. These are outstanding records in terms of economic and social progress. So it seems to me one must be careful in generalizing on these matters. That's the first point. Second point I would like to underscore is the following. You're absolutely right. The way forward is the digital frontier. And the irony here is that countries in the region want to install 5G, and they have found serious objections on the part of Washington. They do not want countries to embrace the cutting-edge technology that is 5G. Now, they are doing it nonetheless, but it has been quite an uphill struggle. So it seems to me it would be important to agree on the fact that we are in the digital age, and that is the way forward, and that objections to the digital development of countries in the region are not helpful. We need a different approach. It's something that allows the region to make progress on the digital frontier.
Claudia, let me ask you this question. We've heard a lot of the problems in the region. We've heard that voters are going and electing new leaders. One thing that's been absent, I think all of us can agree on of late in terms of dealing with COVID, the economy, is strong leadership. Out of this crop of new candidates, are there any that jump out at you that you're going to keep your eye on in terms of leadership to see how they do?
Yeah, I think the question of leadership during COVID, I think Brazil has the same problems of many other countries in the region. Now, we had a very high number of cases. We have a late development in vaccines. So there is this perception that the government did not act as it should. But I don't think this is a main issue of the campaign. I think the main issue of the campaign will be economic issues. I think it is a consequence of the pandemic, like we saw unemployment reaching record highs. We saw economic growth plummeting during the pandemic. And Brazil, if we look at the level of vaccinations, Brazil has a higher percentage of population now that has 2 doses of the vaccine than the United States. Almost 70% of the population already has 2 doses of the vaccine. And it made that the Omicron wave, in terms of deaths in Brazil, proportionally, we are seeing much lower number of deaths than the United States, where there is this resistance towards the vaccine. So, and I think if Omicron is the last wave of the pandemic, I don't think the pandemic will be the main issue in the campaign. The main issue will be the economic consequences of the pandemic. And in this area, Lula is having, I think he's trying to differentiate himself from Bolsonaro with a more pragmatic, less ideological rhetoric towards issues that the common people are facing.
We've got about 20 seconds left. A recent poll shows Lula da Silva leading Bolsonaro by about 17 points. I'd like to leave it with you, Claudia. Is it likely to get tighter? What do you expect the outcome to be? And again, if you can, briefly.
Mm-hmm. No, I think Lula has a strong lead in the polls. And I think Lula does not want to portray this election as a polarization between Lula and Bolsonaro. And Bolsonaro wants to portray this election as a polarization between left and right. And I think the one that is more successful with their narrative have more chance to win. Right. Lula is presenting himself as a moderate, as a center candidate. He's reaching for center or center-right parties.
All right. I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. We've run out of time, but thank you so much. I want to thank all our guests. That's going to do it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for being with us.